We live surrounded by stimuli, voices, noises, but few truly think. And those who think too much often pay a high price for it. This video is not about genius in the usual sense, but about that kind of lucidity that unsettles, that cuts through, that sees what others pretend not to see. That kind of intelligence which, as Schopenhauer said, carries within itself the discomfort of not belonging. Throughout this video we will walk the winding paths of the lucid mind, the burdens it bears, the walls it faces, and the silent strength that sustains those who insist on thinking for themselves. 1. Loneliness as the curse of the lucid. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from the absence of company, but from an excess of awareness. When someone begins to see what others ignore, when they question what everyone accepts, distance settles in, not physical but existential. The lucid one, by seeing beyond the surface, uncovers truths that are unwelcome, because most people prefer the comfort of illusion. And thus, intelligence becomes a kind of silent curse. The more you understand, the less you are able to belong. Lucidity comes at a price. Dialogues become disguised monologues. Parties become empty rituals. The search for depth runs into a sea of shallow distractions. Many confuse this with arrogance, but it's really just misalignment. The restless mind that wants to understand why things are the way they are ends up being perceived as inconvenient by a culture that values conformity over reflection. How can one live in a world that sees exaggeration where you only see intellectual honesty? Arthur Schopenhauer described the loneliness of the wise as inevitable. Not out of pride, but because it's rare to find resonance in the crowd. In his view, the deep thinker doesn't choose to distance himself, he simply finds himself further away as awareness deepens. And indeed, the modern world seems to reward distraction and penalize reflective silence. In a society that rushes, stopping to think is almost an act of rebellion. But perhaps this loneliness is not a punishment. Perhaps it's a kind of protection. The lucid mind needs space to breathe, silence to digest what it sees. It's not an imposed exclusion, but a strategic retreat. In the end, the loneliness of the intelligent may hurt, but it's within that space that the soul finds its most authentic voice. 2. The pain of perceiving what others ignore. There is a peculiar pain that accompanies the more conscious. The pain of perceiving what the majority ignores or chooses to ignore. This pain doesn't scream, doesn't bleed, but corrodes in silence. It's the discomfort of seeing the hidden gears behind appearances, of feeling the weight of human contradictions where others see only routine. Intelligence here is not a gift to be celebrated, but a burden that makes everything more intense, more complex, more real. It's not uncommon for more lucid people to report early existential exhaustion. How can one keep smiling upon realizing the vanity in relationships, the hypocrisy in structures, the emptiness behind so many certainties? Knowledge doesn't offer rest, it demands responsibility. And in that sense, the more one understands the world, the harder it is to bear it. What was simple becomes ambiguous. What seemed normal reveals its disguised cruelty. Ignorance, after all, carries a certain relief that knowledge will never allow. Schopenhauer, influenced by philosophical pessimism, claimed that awareness amplifies pain. He saw the world as a stage of suffering and insatiable desire, and those who deeply grasp this can no longer pretend everything is fine. That's why many choose to anesthetize the mind with distractions, not out of weakness, but as a survival instinct. Seeing too much is often a continuous trauma. But there is a hidden beauty in this pain. The pain of lucidity is also the doorway to authenticity. It's in this pain that thoughts that do not bow are forged, souls that cannot be bought. Suffering from knowing too much may seem pointless, but it's precisely this suffering that separates the herd from the thinker. And paradoxically, it's in this suffering that true meaning is born. Living with your eyes open even when everything inside you screams to shut them. 3. When depth scares the shallow. There's an almost primal discomfort in the face of depth. Not because it's dangerous in itself, but because it requires a kind of dive that many are not willing or prepared to make. When someone brings unsettling questions, uncomfortable truths, or ideas that challenge consensus, the usual reaction isn't curiosity but defensiveness. And that defensiveness often shows up as rejection. A rejection that isn't rational but instinctive, a reflex of the fear of leaving the shallow end. The problem is that the deep mind can't fake superficiality for long. It feels too much, thinks too much, questions everything. And that destabilizes those who are satisfied with ready-made answers. The rejection then isn't about the person per se but what they represent, a threat to the collective comfort zone. When you don't fit into social molds, it's not uncommon for people to try to break you to make you fit, or simply push you out. This is where Schopenhauer's thinking shines. He saw the common man as one who lives in immediacy, self-interest, and repetition. The superior man, the thinker, lives in a state of contemplation and analysis that cannot be understood by those trapped in mechanical routine. This creates a chasm between worldviews, and instead of building bridges, society often builds walls. But this distance also protects. Depth does scare, but it also filters. It drives the shallow away but attracts those ready to dive. That's why brilliant minds, though solitary, are never completely alone. They speak to a few but touch deeply. And maybe that is the highest mission of intelligence. Not to please everyone but to awaken those still asleep. For ignorance is socially comfortable. We live in a culture where deep knowledge is viewed with suspicion and ignorance, often, with sympathy. Not by accident. Ignorance has something pacifying about it. It simplifies the complex, avoids dilemmas, and shields the individual from the anguish of realizing the absurdity of the world. Thinking too much is uncomfortable. Questioning is tiring. That's why the most common path is conformity, living on the surface and calling it normalcy. What's curious is how this normalcy charges a hidden price, the sacrifice of authenticity. To be accepted, the individual often has to silence their intelligence, suppress their sensitivity, and adopt the language of the crowd. This creates a system where mediocrity not only survives but is rewarded. Questions are discouraged. Depth is ridiculed. Difference is isolated. And thus, little by little, critical thinking is replaced by slogans and trends. Schopenhauer foresaw this when he criticized what he called the collective intellect. For him, public opinion was formed by people who think little and repeat a lot. In this setting, to shine is a threat. To have your own ideas is dangerous. And the more you question, the greater your risk of being excluded. After all, ignorance is easier to control. Intelligence is not. It's subversive. It disrupts. And for a society that values stability over truth, that is unbearable. But there's a cruel contradiction here. The same society that despises the wise and idolizes the superficial also consumes their fruits when it suits them. Books, inventions, theories, everything is born from the minds it tried to silence. This shows that, deep down, the problem was never intelligence but the mirror it holds up to others. And facing that mirror, for many, is more painful than living in a comfortable lie. 5. Envy disguised as criticism. Not all criticism is honest. Many are disguises, masks of envy dressed as arguments. When someone stands out for their intelligence or lucidity, it's common for discomfort to appear disguised as opinion. What's at stake isn't the content but the brilliance. Because to shine in this world is dangerous. It illuminates others' mediocrity. And few can stand that reflection. That's why the more you show what others avoid, the more you'll be targeted, not for being wrong but for being a threat. This mechanism is ancient. From Socrates to Schopenhauer, the most unsettling thinkers have been targets of mockery, exclusion, and even persecution. Social criticism in this context works as a pressure valve. The collective, instead of confronting its own limitations, prefers to attack those who expose them. Thus, the intelligent becomes arrogant. The deep becomes strange. The sensitive weak. And the truthful dangerous. All to preserve the myth that everyone is the same. But envy is cowardly. It doesn't attack directly. It infiltrates through jokes, passive-aggressive comments, calculated silences. It manifests as advice disguised as concern. No need to overcomplicate. Do you think you're better than others? Phrases that don't question ideas, but try to belittle the thinker. It's a symbolic lynching where the punishment isn't physical but emotional. Isolation, exclusion, subtle judgment. Still, there is an unnegotiable dignity in not hiding. In not dimming your light to fit in. Because, in the end, being criticized for thinking is a sign that you are still alive inside. Society may attack, but it cannot stop consciousness from pulsing. And that is the greatest strength of the lucid. Being attacked for speaking what no one wants to hear and still continuing to speak. 6. A cruel paradox of the human world. There is a cruel paradox in the human world. The truer someone is, the more discomfort they cause. This happens because truth in its raw nature unmasks. It reveals what's been swept under the rug, challenges entrenched beliefs, and breaks the illusion of safety many cling to. That's why the bearer of truth is often confused with its content, and rejected for both. Not out of malice but for self-preservation. Lucidity doesn't arrive gently. It invades, destabilizes, pulls the ground out from under you. And not everyone is ready for that. Most prefer to live in comfortable narratives, even if false, because the real demands change. And change hurts. That's why, when someone points out what is right in front of everyone but no one wants to see, they are treated as a threat not for being wrong but for being too right. Clarity becomes a social sin. Schopenhauer said the world is a theater of appearances, and few can stand to see backstage. Those who dare lift the curtain end up paying the price with loneliness, contempt, and misunderstanding. Truth doesn't soften. It doesn't please. And that's exactly why those who speak it become targets. The discomfort isn't rational, it's visceral. It's as if the entire social body recoils from someone who refuses to play along with the charade. But there's a quiet freedom in all of this. Because whoever accepts the truth, even when rejected, frees themselves from the chains of approval. They no longer need to please. They don't need to fit in. They can finally live in peace with what they know, even if that means walking alone. And perhaps this is the hardest mission of lucidity, not just seeing what is real but sustaining that gaze even when the whole world prefers to close its eyes. 7. The price of not adapting. There is an unspoken expectation that everyone should conform to the standard. But those who think too much, feel too much, perceive too much, simply don't fit. True intelligence doesn't adapt, it overflows. It questions what is imposed, challenges what is repeated, finds odd what is accepted. And for that it pays a price. Not the price of choice but of existence. The different one, even before being understood, has already been judged. And almost always condemned to the margins. The exclusion of the more lucid is not a system error, it's part of how it works. Because to maintain social rhythm, a minimum level of predictability is necessary. And those who think outside the box disrupt that flow. They disturb. They unsettle. So society creates subtle pruning mechanisms. It starts in schools with curriculums that reward obedience. It continues in workplaces that favor those who follow orders. And it strengthens in culture which ridicules deep thinking. Schopenhauer described the world as a hostile space for the genuine thinker. He saw intelligence not as an adaptive advantage, but as an inevitable source of anguish and isolation. In a universe of repetition, original thinking isn't celebrated, it's silenced. Because it demands listening, reflection, revision. And few are willing to pay that price. It's easier to exclude the different than to question the norm. But at the same time, there is a fierce beauty in this incompatibility. Because it marks those who weren't made to imitate. The non-adapted is the one who, even while suffering, preserves their essence. They may be excluded, but they are never corrupted. And in a world that rewards repetition, that is already an act of revolution. 8. The false humility demanded of the wise. There is a disconcerting paradox in how society deals with intelligence. It admires it silently but punishes it loudly. The wise are expected to hide their light, the sharp to pretend they're distracted, the deep to act shallow. This is called humility, but in truth, it's just an unspoken demand that the intelligent don't outshine others. As if thinking too much were arrogance and standing out, a threat. Contemporary culture promotes a curious inversion. Flaunting ignorance is acceptable, even entertaining. But displaying erudition, sensitivity, or clarity draws sideways glances. It's as if there's an invisible quota of mediocrity to be respected. Anything beyond that becomes disturbing. The brilliant, instead of being an inspiration, becomes a mirror that amplifies others' insecurities. And in that reflection, few dare to look. Schopenhauer loathed intellectual pretense. For him, true humility wasn't in denying your own light, but in not bowing to public opinion. And that lesson remains relevant today. The problem isn't shining, it's where you shine. In shallow environments, depth will always be seen as vanity. The lucid mind is constantly pressured to stay quiet, to fit in, as if thinking were a privilege that should be hidden. But pretending ignorance is a silent betrayal of oneself. Every time a wise person stays silent to be accepted, the world grows a little dimmer. And every time someone shines without apologizing, a new field of possibility opens. Because true humility is not about hiding, it's about continuing to offer light, even knowing many prefer the dark. 9. Arthur Schopenhauer and the collective mind. Arthur Schopenhauer was ruthless in analyzing collective behavior. He called public opinion irrational, driven by impulses, vanity, and fleeting interests. The public is a beast with 1,000 heads and no reason, he said, denouncing how easily common sense adheres to empty ideas, passing trends, and convenient truths. For him, thinking independently was not just rare but profoundly dangerous. Those who dare are met with hostility. And this hostility doesn't arise from the content itself, but from the act. The mere act of thinking differently is seen as an affront. In a world where people crave belonging, defending unpopular ideas is an invitation to exile. Intellectual autonomy is mistaken for arrogance. well-founded criticism for hostility. And so, the independent thinker is pushed out not by mistake but by refusal to conform. Schopenhauer knew that most people form opinions not based on truth, but on repetition. What's said by many becomes truth out of convenience. And in this setting, the lucid individual is like a foreign body in the social organism. They disturb because they won't submit. They make noise because they demand coherence. And that's precisely why free thinking doesn't inspire admiration, but resistance, an almost automatic resistance. But paradoxically, it is this very resistance that validates the value of freedom of thought. Because true wisdom doesn't seek approval. It seeks clarity. It doesn't bow to the masses' chorus but stands firm even in solitude. And perhaps that's Schopenhauer's greatest legacy. Teaching that thinking for yourself is not just a right, it's a necessary risk for anyone who wants to live with integrity. 10. True intelligence is an act of resistance. To be truly intelligent in the deepest sense is an act of resistance. Resistance against apathy, against manipulation, against the seduction of empty consensus. To persist in lucidity in a world that rewards distraction is almost heroic. It's not just about knowing but about sustaining that knowledge in the face of mockery, indifference, and loneliness. Thinking becomes an ethical gesture, a way of keeping the flame of consciousness alive while everything around begs for anesthesia. The wise one, unlike the technical scholar, doesn't seek to fit into the demands of their time. They don't bow to easy narratives or intellectual trends. They observe and understand. And that's precisely why they are misunderstood. Society, ruled by cycles of euphoria and fear, demands speed, lightness, and adaptability. But genuine thought is slow, dense, and uncomfortable. It wounds before it heals. And that's why it's almost always rejected. Schopenhauer saw the authentic thinker as someone out of place, not from misfit but from excessive vision. They don't belong to their time because they see beyond it. Like a seed carrying the DNA of future forests, the wise one speaks of things their time doesn't yet know how to hear. That's why often they are silenced in life, but their ideas bloom much later. Lucidity has this delayed impact. It hurts now but frees later. Being intelligent, then, is much more than reasoning well. It's having the courage to stay awake when everyone else is asleep. It's bearing the weight of seeing clearly, and still choosing to love the world, even if it's broken. Because those who resist with lucidity are not just thinking. They are planting meaning in a soil where almost everything has been reduced to noise. To be lucid in a world that fears truth is a daily exercise in courage and integrity. Throughout this video we saw that the price of lucidity can be high. Loneliness, rejection, misunderstanding. But we also understood that this path, however harsh it may seem, is where the freedom to be whole blooms. And perhaps the most important question is, are you willing to sustain your consciousness even when it becomes a burden? Or will you choose the relief of conformity? If any part of this video touched you, question yourself. Share in the comments which of these ideas confronted you or comforted you. Here, each reflection is a seed. And each awakened mind, a fertile field. If this journey made sense to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We still have much to explore.